Chapter 7 South to Freedom. Lyddie set out at once, or nearly at once. First, Rafina made the girl put her own second best pair of boots. They were, of course, too large for Lyddie, so she had to wait while the cook fetched 2 extra pairs of stockings and paper with which to stuff the toes. When Lyddie objected, Rafina kept muttering, "A person can't walk to Massachusetts barefoot. Not in April, she can't." Next, Rafina made her wait while she packed her a parcel of food large enough to feed a table of harvesters. And finally, she gave her a tiny cloth purse with $5 silver in it. "It's too much," Lyddie protested. "I'm not having your dead body on my conscience," the cook said. "It will be enough for coach fare and the stops along the way. The only tavern food I trust is my own." "But the mistress—" "You leave the mistress to me." "I'll pay you back the money, with interest when I can," Lyddie promised. Tryphena only shook her head and gave her that pat on the buttocks as though she were 5 years old. "Just don't forget me, eh? Give your old friend a thought now and again. That's all the interest I'll be wanting." It was 3 in the afternoon before she could even start her journey, but she would not let Tryphena persuade her to wait. She might let the mistress talk her into staying, or lose her nerve if she didn't set out at once. Her heart was light, even if her feet felt clumsy in their makeshift boots and oversized stockings. She remembered Ezekiel and thought, "He walked north for freedom, and I am walking south." She had forgotten in the excitement that she had already walked above 10 miles that day, but her feet remembered. Long before dark, they were chafing in the unaccustomed bindings of stockings and ill-fitting boots, reminding her that they had done too much. She sat down on a rock and took the boots off, but before long she felt chilled, so she put them on again and started out, but more slowly than before. Then, just as dusk, the sky opened and it began to rain. Not light spring showers, but cold, soaking torrents of rain streaming down her face, icicling rivulets down her chest and legs. She was obliged, reluctantly, to stop in the next village and seek shelter for the night. The mistress of the local inn was at first shocked to see a young girl traveling alone, and then solicitous. "You look near drowned," she cried, and asked where she thought she was headed. "Lowell, is it? Well, the stagecoach will be coming through by the end of the week. Work for me till then, and I'll give you your board." Lyddie hesitated, but her sodden clothes and blistered feet reminded her how unsuited she was to continue the journey. She gratefully accepted the mistress's offer and worked so hard that before the week was out, the woman was begging her to forget Lowell and stay on. But Lyddie was not to be persuaded. She boarded the coach on Thursday, and in the same dismal rain she'd arrived in, handing over 3 of her precious dollars to the driver, she settled herself in the corner of the carriage. There were only 2 other passengers, a man and a woman who seemed to be married, though they hardly spoke to each other. The woman gave Lyddie's dress and shawl and strange boots a critical going over with her eyes, then settled again to her knitting, which the bumping of the coach made difficult. With the muddy roads, it took 2 days to get to Windsor. They had not even left Vermont. Lyddie often wished she had saved her dollars and walked, rain or no rain. Surely she could have made it just as fast. But at least the disagreeable people left the coach at Windsor. The bed in the inn was infested with bugs, so she felt both filthy and itchy the next morning, and was not happily surprised that the coach, which had seemed overcrowded with 3, was now to carry 6 as far as Lowell. One of the passengers was a girl about her own age. Lyddie wanted to ask her if she too was going for a factory girl, but she had a young man with her who appeared to be her brother, so Lyddie was hesitant to speak. Then, too, she remembered the look the previous female passenger had given her. The 6 of them were jammed into the carriage. There was hardly room for any of them to move, yet the rolling and pinching of the coach seemed worse rather than before the load. Lyddie tried to sit delicately on one hip and then the other to spread the bruising out if possible. One of the gentlemen lit a large pipe, and the odor of it nearly made her retch. Fortunately, another gentleman reminded him sternly that there were ladies present, and the first man reluctantly tapped his pipe against the metal fixings of the door. But the stench had already been added to the air of foul breath and strong body odors. Lyddie longed for a healthy smell of a farmyard. People were so much fouler than critters. And still, when the others weren't concentrating on keeping their seats in the swaying coach, they were looking at her clothes especially. At first she was mortified, but the longer they rode, the angrier she became. How rude they were, these so-called gentry. Everyone's clothes were a disgrace before they'd reached Lowell. The thaw and spring rains had turned parts of the roadway into muddy sloughs, and despite the coachman's skill, early on the last morning they were stuck fast. The passengers were all obliged to alight, and the 4 men ordered by the coachman to push the wheels out of the rut. Lyddie watched the hapless gentleman heave and shove and sweat, all to no avail. The coachman yelled encouragement from above. The men grunted and cursed below as their fancy breeches and overcoats turned down with the mud, and their lovely beaver hats went rolling off down the road. After at least a quarter of an hour of watching, she could stand their stupidity no longer. Lyddie took off her worn shawl, tied it about her waist, and tucked up her skirts under it. She found a flat stone to put it under the mirrored wheel. Then she waded in, her narrow shoulders shoving two of the gaping men aside as she sat her strong right shoulder against the rear wheel, ordered the men to rear boot, and called out, "1, 2, 3, heave!" Above, she heard the laughter of the coachman. The men beside her were not smiling, but they did push together. The wheel rolled over the stone, and the coach was free to continue the journey. She was filthy, but she hardly cared. She could only think of how ignorant, how useless her fellow passengers had been. None of them thanked her, but she hardly noticed. She was eager to be going, but not to ride inside. She looked up at the still smiling coachman. "Can I come up?" she called. He nodded. Lyddie scrambled up beside him. None of the gentlemen offered her a hand, but she needed none, having spent her life climbing trees and ladders and roofs. The coachman was still chuckling as he gave the horses a crack of the whip. Cries of protest rose up from the passengers below. He jerked the reins, his eyes twinkling, as more cries came up from the irate inmates as they tried to disentangle their bodies in the carriage and settle themselves on the seats once more. He shook his head at Lyddie and held the pawing team for a few moments until the jostling in the carriage finally ceased. "You're a hardy one, aren't you?" he said, reaching into the box behind him to pull out a heavy robe. "Here, this'll keep the chill off." She wrapped the robe around her head and body. "Silly fools," she said. "Not common sense of a quill pig 'mongst the lot of 'em. Why didn't you tell them what to do, eh?" "What?" he said. "And lose the entertainment?" Lyddie couldn't help but laugh, remembering the sight of those sweating, swearing, filthy gentlemen, and now they were further poisoning the already stale air of the carriage with their odor and road mud. Indeed, someone was already raising the shade to let in a bit of cold, fresh air. "So, you're for the factory life," Lyddie nodded. "I need the money." He glanced sideways at her. "Those young women dress like Boston ladies," he said. "I don't care for fancy dress. There's debts on my farm." "And it's your farm now, is it?" "My father's," she said. "But he headed west for 4 years ago, and we haven't heard—" "You're a stout one," he said. "Ain't you brothers to help?" "One," she said, "and he'd be a great help, only my mother put him out to the miller, so until—" "Have you someone to look out for you and Lowell? A relative or a friend?" She shook her head. "I'll do all right on my own." "I've no doubt of that," he said, "but a friend to put in a word can't hurt. Let me take you to my sister's. She runs a boarding house, number 5 it is, of the Concord Manufacturing Corporation." "I'm obliged for your kindness, sir, but—" "Think of it as payment for your help. You could have had it out in no time, had you—" "But never such fun. Coaching can be a wearisome, lonesome job, my girl. I take my pleasure where I can. Did you see those gentlemen's faces, having to be rescued by a slip of a farm girl?" They crossed the bridge into the city late that afternoon, and city it surely was. It seemed to Lyddie that there was as many buildings crowded before her as sheep in a shearing shed. But they were not soft and murmuring as sheep. They were huge and foreboding in the gray light of afternoon. She would not have believed that the world contained as much brick as there was in a single building here. They were giants, 5 and 6 stories high and as long as the length of a large pasture. Chimneys belching smoke reached to the low-hanging sky. And the noise of it! Her impulse was to cover her ears, but she held her hands tightly in her lap. She would not begin to be afraid now, she who had stared down a bear and conversed easily with a runaway slave. The other passengers in their muddy clothing and with their various trunks alighted at the Merrimack Hotel. Lyddie could tell at a glance it was too grand for her purse and person. In the end, she waited until the coachman had seen the horses and carriage taken care of, and then let him walk her to his sister's boarding house. "I've brought you a little chip of Vermont granite," he explained to the plump, smiling woman who met them at the door. Then he added, "We'd best come in by back. Run into a little muddy stretch on the way down."